Carnegie Endowment, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here today, and a special pleasure to welcome India's Finance Minister, Arun Jately. 1 week ago today, I was in New Delhi for the launch of Carnegie India, our endowment's 6th international center. We could not have asked for a warmer welcome from the President, Prime Minister, and our many other friends and partners across India. And we could not have asked for a stronger endorsement of the logic and purpose of our new endeavor. The logic is fairly straightforward. In the 21st century, no region will be more consequential for global order than Asia. India's rise is an extraordinarily significant feature of that new landscape. The same is true with a strategic partnership between India and the United States, a partnership between the world's 2 largest democracies, 2 of the world's largest economies, and 2 countries that, for the first time in history, have a deep stake in each other's success. India plays a critical role in nearly every region and issue of consequence, from the future of democracy to nuclear nonproliferation, great power politics to climate, and the impact of technological innovation on international affairs. Understanding India's perspectives will be essential to meeting these and other challenges head-on. Carnegie India's purpose is equally straightforward. It is an Indian institution, led by a prominent Indian strategist in Raja Mohan and staffed by the most promising young Indian scholars and practitioners. Together, they'll focus their initial efforts on 3 areas: India's political economy of reform, its foreign and security policy, and the role of innovation and technology in India's internal transformation and international relations. In each of those areas, Carnegie India will benefit from the perspective of other Carnegie centers, just as our other centers will benefit from Carnegie India. Together, the growing Carnegie platform can help thinkers and doers alike make better sense of an increasingly disordered world. The theme for the Carnegie India launch was India as a leading power. In a country where there are even more opinions than there are people, and there are a lot of people in India, there is one proposition that goes undisputed. The essential prerequisite for India's success abroad is its economic dynamism at home. One of the people chiefly responsible for delivering that dynamism is Minister Jately. When he assumed the finance portfolio in May of 2014, India's economy was defined by slowing growth, large deficits, and high inflation. 2 years later, the picture has changed considerably. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi and Minister Jately, India is today the world's fastest growing major economy. Inflation has moderated, and the government has remained committed to an ambitious deficit reduction plan. Just weeks ago, Minister Jately presented his 3rd budget since taking office, a budget that seeks to ensure that India remains on a sustained trajectory of high and inclusive growth. The minister's task was significant, especially at a time of fierce global economic headwinds, fierce regional headwinds, and the equally fierce political headwinds that are the mark of any large and complex democracy. While the challenges are indeed significant, the opportunities for India's economy are vast. And I'm confident that if India builds on progress to date, the opportunities for India as a leading power and partner in the region and in the world are equally vast. I'm hopeful that Carnegie India can play its role in helping India seize these opportunities. And I'm grateful that Minister Jately has kindly agreed to share with us his views on the road ahead. So please join me in welcoming Minister Arun Jately.
Ambassador Burns, Ashley Talent, staff at the Carnegie, ladies and gentlemen. Let me at the very outset congratulate Carnegie for opening its office in India, your most recent expansion. And I'm sure we'll see more of you in India, because I do believe India also has an important story to tell. You rightly mentioned the that 2 years ago, when the present government in India had taken over, the situation with regard to India looked quite challenging. And since then, the global situation has never been helpful. It's in this adversity that India really has to chalk out its own plan for growth and to stand out itself. When I look back, besides the global factors, I think two areas where we did err in the recent past, before the government took over. The government was considered at that time not to be decisive enough. Enthusiasm with regard to India was waning off because policy changes which could have been possible. I think in the political model at the time which the government had adopted were not fast enough. The direction was not clear. And when I say the direction was not clear, it was really concentrated in terms of going back to where India was in the 1960s and the 70s, where you started concentrating on distribution of or redistribution of the existing resource, rather than concentrate on increasing productivity and improving upon India's very potential. And therefore, I think even before we've completed our first 24 months, we've been in office for a little less than 23 months, the key emphasis, I think, have been three. The first has been decisiveness. The second has been consistency in terms of policy direction. And the third important one has been transparency in functioning. Now, if you elaborate on each one of them, which I'm sure in the course of the interaction I'll have a greater opportunity of explaining, I'll just confine myself to a few brief comments in the opening. There are a series of steps consistently which the government has taken, one after the other. But the most important point is that all these are aimed in one direction. All governments commit mistakes. But in terms of the economic direction, this government is yet to commit its first major economic mistake. In terms of not having reversed the direction, having maintained the direction, column writers and editorial comments can always say, is a big bang idea not possible? But if you look at the totality of various policy decisions which have been taken, I think India is passing through one of the most significant phases in history. And I would say, if 1991 was perhaps the most critical one, next only to that phase, the kind of decisions which have been taken, this becomes the most important and critical phase. We've opened out. And opening out in an economy where there was a conventional resistance to opening out, I think has been significant. The second important aspect of that opening out has been that there is a very large body of politics and popular opinion in India which supports this reform process. Normally in democracies which have a very large population still living in poverty, the resistance to reform is very high because a large number of people have not benefited from them. But I think we are at a phase where public opinion also is getting restless. They want things to move faster. So if we see sector after sector, the economy has opened out. It's opened out to international investment. Some conventional conditionalities which used to be there have all been removed. And I think the most important aspect of this has been that not at one stage has there been any resistance or even a sectoral protest from any section of people. And I think that's the high point. India had a reputation for not being the easiest place to do business in. Now, this was contributed because of several factors. And I would suggest that three important factors in this which were holding us back. One, we had a bad image because of corruption. Two, our procedures were too long-winded. And three, even if the government of India wanted to reform, the actual business activity had to be in the states. Some of the regions were not cooperative enough. I think the significant change which has taken place is, one, a lot of transparency has come into the system, and every decision has been in the direction of eliminating governmental discretions. And therefore, you have a government which is operating, which is now free from any kind of needless controversies, a government where decisions are not questioned for being for collateral reasons. And I think the second important aspect is that most state governments, the pace may be different, are now competing with each other to make sure that the first right of investment comes into their states. So it's not only the central government which has eased the processes. You don't have to wait for investment clearances or environmental clearances now for years. It comes within a matter of weeks. You don't have to follow up permissions. The regions also, the regional governments also are competing with each other. And therefore, there is a kind of a competitiveness between the states. I've been almost visiting every alternative state in India which now tries to woo global investors through investment meets. I think that second hurdle also is gone. The procedural hurdles, I think this is work still in progress. How to shortcut those procedures? Have we completely overcome it? The answer clearly is no. But I think there's a great movement in that direction which is going on. Central government has become much easier. State governments are trying to cut short their procedures like single window, etc. And I think the movement seems to be in the right direction itself. Elimination of government discretions. I think the courts, the other democratic institutions, which are watchdog institutions, have also had a lot of role to play in this. And therefore, the tendency of governments not to hold power in themselves and allow market mechanisms to take decisions. Allocation of resources, natural resources, I think this is all a movement where discretions are an area of the part. And therefore, nobody can now come and try and even make a suggestion because the political establishment really hasn't kept that power in its own hands at all. The global situation not particularly helpful, and therefore impacts on currency, markets is always there. But of course, one aspect which has helped us, and I think which is very significant, has been the oil prices. And therefore, India has intelligently used that resource which came into our hands. We didn't pass on the entire benefit to the consumer. Instead, keeping environmental reasons in mind and also reasons of public finance, the government kept a significant part of it in terms of revenue. And even therefore, in an adverse global situation, our revenues available with the government saw a significant improvement because of this. The resources saw, and most of these resources have been diverted towards the social sector and infrastructure creation, as I will just explain. Taxation. We have two kinds of parallel approaches, which is still work in progress. The direct taxes, I think we are rationalizing a lot of them. India had earned a bad name for institutions like the retrospective taxation. I think these are all issues of the past. And with every reform which is taking place, we are bringing the taxations downward. Our personal taxation rates are probably one of the most competitive ones in the world, so that taxpayers have a lot of extra money to spend. Additionally, as far as direct taxation, corporate tax is concerned, I've already announced and I'm in the process of implementing. In some limited areas, it's been implemented to bring down corporate tax down to 25%. while phasing out all discretions and exemptions of the government. One of the big major indirect tax reforms, the goods and services tax, is still held up in the upper house. I think the numbers are changing, and I'm trying to be in touch with the only party which is in opposition to the proposal in its present shape, not opposed to the idea itself. And I do hope to see it being cleared very soon. Subsidy rationalization has been a great unsung reform which has taken place. And now this has, it's moving from sector to sector, and the direct cash transfer, which is now supported by the recent legislation which we've passed, is enabling us to target the subsidy only to those who need them, leave out the leakages, and save a lot of revenue so that it can be directed towards the sectors of the population which really deserves it. The two main gaps in our economy, one was the agricultural sector. And last 2 years particularly saw a very bad monsoon, a weak monsoon. And therefore, while other sectors were doing relatively okay, the agricultural sector had suffered. And this impacted on rural economy, which impacted on rural purchasing powers, which in turn impacted on the overall growth rate itself. Our 7.5% growth rate range of the last 2 years could have been significantly higher, but for this inadequate monsoon in the last 2 years. Hopefully, I've seen in the last 2-3 days, the predictions seem to be much kinder to us this year. And if that were to happen, we are capable of doing significantly improving upon our growth rates itself. And therefore, one of the important emphasis has been to divert a very large part of our resource into agriculture itself. So areas like building rural roads, irrigation, electrification of every village in India, a huge provision for rural housing, interest subvention for farmers, a crop insurance, a very radical crop insurance scheme for the farmers. Now, these are various ways of empowering rural India. And I think realizing that that's one weaker segment of the economy itself, this priority spending is going to probably remain over the next few years itself. Infrastructure. I think to make use of the current economic situation and improve upon India's infrastructure, because our needs for infrastructure spending, some of people have calculated them as to a phenomenally high amount, over $400 billion requirement, a kind of resource which we don't have. So a very large part of the public resource is being put into infrastructure. Our national highway program, which had almost was paralyzed when the government took over 23 months ago, I think has started booming again. It's again turned into a big success story. And our target slowly is moving towards what was an incredible target of building 30 kilometers of highway per day. Today, I checked up the figures, we have about 230 odd highways actually under construction. We've crossed the 20 kilometer a day mark, and I'm sure we are moving towards that direction. For rural roads, we've allocated between the center and the states this year 3 times the kind of resource which we were allocating in the past, because this is one area where private sector doesn't invest, and therefore public spending itself is to take place. Indian Railways has a very significant amount of capital expenditure, a modernization plan. It's a very large railways, a very large number of people use it, and therefore the capital expenditure into the railways itself is going up. 25 new airports in the regions to be created. You already have some 60 to 70 operational airports. We have some airfields which are not used, and therefore some belonging to the state government, some belonging to the airport authority to be all initiated again. Some by the kind of resource our airport authority has. A private sector participation also in the airport sector is taking place. Corporatized ports with a lot of private sector and international investment. Smart cities, power sector. Now, these are all areas where we've been concentrating on. One big challenge of the slowdown of the past has been that some sectors not only slowed down, but they left an adverse impact on the balance sheets of the banks itself. And now this is, and this in its turn curtailed the ability of the banks themselves to lend for growth. And therefore, besides recapitalizing the banks, professionalizing their management, the process which is on, I think addressing each one of those sectors, so therefore the highways, the infrastructure, the steel, textiles, power, elaborate steps have been taken. I'm not going into them in the opening statement. If somebody has a clarification about each of the sectors, what we've planned, which we've been doing. Now, dispute resolution in public contracts. Now, as a result, a very large number of public contracts remain paralyzed because of pendency of disputes, escalation of costs, and unless an institutionalized mechanism could be brought in. Now, this required amendment to a series of laws, which also has India's judicial system very powerful, very independent, but awfully slow. And therefore, that had to be expedited. So we've amended some of the laws. The Arbitration Act has been amended to provide for a fast-track arbitration. Every high court in the country, the law has been amended to provide for a commercial division which will be there in every bench, which will be a special bench in every high court to resolve the disputes. You have the insolvency laws is almost in the final phase, and I hope to see it being legislated in the month of May itself. Resolution of disputes of large public contracts, empowering the banks to be in a position to commercially settle disputes. Now, there are several other laws which require a significant change, and that exercise itself is on. We've significantly empowered the states. So, Indian regional governments, which are also very close to the people because they are the ones where the economic activity has to be carried out, a significant amount of resource. Additionally, the restructuring of governmental finances has taken place. So, more money now goes to the regions than is available with the central government, and I don't grudge it because their ability to spend both in the social sector and otherwise is also significant. I think before I conclude, besides the normal campaigns the government takes up, I think the financial inclusion program of the government, which includes bringing in and preparing India for a larger social security system, which was erstwhile absent. We are in the initial stages. I call it the initial stages because when the government took over 23 months ago, most of India was not even connected to the banking system. So our financial inclusion, to include the 42% not connected to the banking system, has been extremely successful. So everybody virtually has been connected to the banking system. That was just a campaign which succeeded. Offering them low-cost life insurance policies, accident policies to people, to make them aware of this, particularly the poorest in India. I think itself, the numbers itself are staggering. You have almost 20-21 million people who were connected to the banking system. You have about 11-12 million people who were, 110 odd million people, 210 who were connected to the banking system, 110 who were connected to these insurance policies. We've started funding the unfunded sections of the society because the system to give jobs to all, I think in terms of micro and slightly higher than micro financing, the first year itself has been extremely successful, and we are relying on this experiment considerably, concentrating on social sector for health schemes for the weakest 1/3 of the Indian population, crop insurance for the farmer. And I think overall, how does it look like when I see the global situation and India in that global situation? First year, we grew by about 7.2, 7.3%. This year, hopefully, it looks like 7.5, 7.6. With a better monsoon prediction for the next year, we could improve upon that. Fiscal deficit, we've taken up this additional expenditure, stuck to the targets. And I think that's something which has been globally recognized and well appreciated. a country which had 5.5%, 6% fiscal deficit down now this year targeting 3.5%. Current account deficit very well under control, inflation under control, interest rates going downwards. So each one of the macroeconomic parameters has its own story to tell. How do I see what are the variables? And that's the last point I have to make. I think amongst the variables, the first, of course, will be, is growth going to return to the rest of the world or not? And that, of course, will determine whether the winds are favorable as far as our own economy is concerned. Are they helpful, or do we still have obstructive headwinds ahead of us? Which way do the oil prices, at what prices oil stabilizes, I think is a second variable. Monsoons this year is an important variable, and hopefully if we have a good monsoon as is being predicted, urban demand in India has moved up. That will significantly push up rural demand, and presently the growth driven by public finances, public spending, foreign direct investment record high, urban demand, and some sectors of in the private sector areas. Telecom has been doing well, pharmaceuticals have been doing well, auto sector has been doing well, the IT, the startups have been all doing well. And I think if rural demand improves, we could see that impacting on other sectors of the private sector also, because the private sector is still a little overstressed. And once that stress dilutes itself, I think India could hope to better its present growth rate, which currently is around 7.5. And I do hope any of these variable factors moving in a favorable direction, we could see the much better next 1 or 2 years as far as Indian economy is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let me join Ambassador Burns in welcoming you again to Carnegie. It's always wonderful to hear you speak, and today you provided an incredibly comprehensive overview of the Indian economy. I want to congratulate you actually for the 2 years of quite remarkable domestic economic management. As you've pointed out, many have argued that India's success in the last 2 years has been a function of a favorable international environment, low oil prices, low commodity prices, and so on. And that's true, but the same could be said for many other countries in the world which haven't done as well. So if India has actually managed to sustain its growth rates despite what has been a universal benefit to all, then there's obviously something that you are doing right. And I hope you keep on doing that. I'm going to open this conversation to people in this audience because I know they are very eager to talk to you. But I want to start off by asking 2 or 3 questions, which I think might set the stage for the discussion to follow. You emphasized quite rightly that the reform program today has reached the stage in India where there is no sectoral resistance, that people see the merits of reform and are willing to support the government in the efforts moving forward. But it appears to me from the outside that one of the impediments to sustained reform is still politics. That very often the opposition to reform now is less on its merits and more because of a political resistance to success. We saw that very clearly in the case of the GST, even though, as you alluded, there were specific issues in contention. When you look at the next 2 to 3 years, how do you see the political landscape in India, and how does that landscape offer you opportunities or constraints?
Well, I think it's also will depend on the kind of discourse and the direction to the discourse and its quality that we are able to give. So far, I haven't seen, in terms of politics, serious challenges in terms of which force a rethink. I don't think that's happened. And even on the GST, while there is, of course, an impatience as far as government is concerned and those supporting the GST is concerned, I can tell you, politics is working the other way. The only group which is creating an obstruction faces daily criticism for having opposed it. And they are on the back foot to rationalize why they are trying to suggest, oh, we are not opposed to the GST, we just want one assurance, we just want one factor change. So they're searching for arguments. I think the difference between 1991 and 2016 in India is that in 1991, what does opening out mean? India had not foreseen the advantage. And if I put it bluntly in political terms, having grown in a Nehruvian regulatory environment, we only understood the benefits of regulation. And it's post-1991 when India started feeling the benefits of under-regulation, and now we've gone through 25 years of that. The body of public opinion that supports reforms is much larger than the one which opposes it. And therefore, even in states erstwhile held by left parties and others, I can see a change in vocabulary, I can see a change in idiom, I can see a change in the virtues of inviting investment, simplifying procedures. Don't forget, Ashley, that not a single law in India has had to be abandoned because of political opposition. As a democracy, you have your own pulls and pressures. It takes time. Some get delayed more. So today, this is the only one which is hanging for some time. And I can tell you it won't hang for too long.
So would it be safe to say that as one looks, over the years to come, that economic liberalism as a worldview, as an agenda, is now the dominant philosophy of managing the economy in India?
Well, I think I'll partly amend what you say. There would be an element of liberalism. There would be allowing people, unleashing their energies and allowing them to grow. But because there is a principal object of even reducing and eliminating poverty, the entire economic planning will need a social conscious. And therefore, you will have to always keep one fact in mind. Does it create jobs? Does it help India's villages? Does it help in, and therefore, is the new resource being used for the underprivileged? And therefore, the element of compassion or a social conscious will have to temper whichever way the economic planning comes. And I think that will be always particular of a model for a country which started with a very large population below the poverty line.
When we were in Delhi for the celebrations surrounding the launch of Carnegie India, Jayant Sinha made the point that the government is moving in the direction of being simultaneously pro-poor and pro-market. And it's a theme that obviously has a great deal of resonance for those of us who live in this country, because the history of this country has been the progressive triumph of development through the market.
See, and you see, when I made an opening comment about what went wrong, you see, what happened in India in the 1970s? The Indira Gandhi days, the government of India concentrated on redistribution of existing resources.
Sure.
Whether it was able to even do that or not itself is a question. But it didn't concentrate on increasing productivity. And therefore, while India happily grew at 2 to 3%, which you used to refer in this part of the world as the Hindu rate of growth, And we thought by just slogans of redistributing that resource could be very popular politics. And that's why I've always called the 1970s and 1980s as the wasted decades of India's economy. And that's where we've learnt our lesson. And therefore, post 1991, when you started concentrating on increasing productivity, increasing more resource, generating more wealth, and then trying to redistribute it, the model is not that it will redistribute on its own. The enrichment of the state then has to be passed on to a particular section. And I think that's particular of the Indian model itself.
So let me ask you two questions. So you are suggesting that there are really two tasks. At one level, you have to increase growth in order to sort of enlarge the pie, which the state then has to redistribute to the deserving sections. Two questions there. One, does the state, as you see it, have the institutional capacity to undertake the kind of targeted redistribution that is merited? That's question one. And two, does the state today have the capacity to undo some of the mishaps of previous years?
I think if you saw a connect between what I said, and that precisely answers your question. What does the entire rationalization of subsidies issue remains? Now look at what we've done. Petrol, diesel, linked to the market. Cooking gas, the rich get eliminated. The poor are, and now you have about almost 140 million get that cooking gas subsidy directly into their bank accounts. So we've been able to save about 25% by a more transparent process which was being wasted on leakages. We've been able to eliminate a number of people. Now the number of people we are eliminating on the top. This year in the budget I have announced that 5 crore, which is 50 million families in India, which is almost 20% of India, the lowest 20% of India, who still depend on that traditional cooking mechanism of a chula. You burn wood or you burn coal. And environmentalists and health experts have indicated that using that mechanism is as bad as smoking 400 cigarettes. And therefore, we've used that saving by eliminating the top layer to gift the more modern equipment to the weakest 20%. Now that's a part of the budget scheme. So you are taking away the resource from top which was being wasted, which was an unfair subsidy, and you are now subsidizing these people. So it's targeted. Secondly, this entire emphasis on spending in the rural areas. What are we doing? We've selected 18,000 villages in India which don't have electricity. And we've given a target till 2019 that each one of the villages will have electricity. Out of 18,000, we've already crossed 5,500 as I speak to you. So the number is far reduced, and we'll do it ahead of that target. Now we are making sure that by 2018, every village in India is connected with a regular road. The next, by 2022, you are creating a provision from the resource that people get housing. What is, after all, this Clean India, Swachh Bharat campaign that the Prime Minister has launched to make sure that every village home has a toilet. The farmers get interest subvented. Now, these are various instrumentalities, or the crop insurance, which is substantially supported for the small farmer by the state itself. Now, these are various instrumentalities we have created because that's where one of the big pits in the economy is. And therefore, what we are now saving from the oil prices, I could have been a reckless populist and said, well, everything is passed on to the consumer, and the consumer of oil is normally a wealthier person by Indian standards. So rather than pass it to him, I've passed on part of the advantage to him. He's got part of the advantage. The other part we've taken out and just put it into this area. And I thought that was much better in terms of the economic model that India needs.
And it satisfies both the economic requirement as well as the social requirement. But let me ask you the other part of the question, which is, as you are trying to undo the legacy issues that you've inherited, what about the huge challenge of disinvestment, the enormous pool of public enterprises that may not be as productive, as rationalized as their counterparts in the private sector? Now, you've set yourself some very ambitious disinvestment targets for the coming year. What is your own sense about the market's ability to generate those kinds of returns that we're looking for?
You see, this is an area where we run into challenges not because of any kind of political resistance, but because of the global economic situation. For instance, in the first 2 years, in terms of sheer volume of what we've disinvested, and don't forget, these were 2 years where the markets were extremely volatile. And therefore, you have to be very careful. I can't sell at very low prices. We've still managed to divest more than what most governments have done it in the past. In fact, the best model came in the Vajpayee government. And in these 2 years, I've already, in terms of quantity, raised more money from divestment than the ones which we raised even during that 6-year period. But that's not enough. You see, there would be some strategic disinvestments. In some cases in the budget this year, we've said we may have recycling of assets taking place. You can segregate an asset and sell it. What has held us slightly back last year was a number of companies which were on our disinvestment plan are in sectors which were globally doing very badly. And therefore, when the global markets are not in the best of health, as far as those sectors are concerned, it was probably not the right time to divest.
I'm going to end my conversation with you in a minute because I want to give others a chance. But there is one last question which arises from what you just said. When you look out a decade or so from now, what role do you see trade and India's integration into the global trading system playing in terms of your vision for long-term growth? We have Fred Bergston in the room here, whom I'm sure will ask you some pointed questions on the subject. But when you think of India's opportunities with respect to the external sector, how do you see India fitting into the evolving trade regime, and what is that impact on India's own growth?
But I think that's also an area where the Indian mindset is evolving. You see, for two good reasons. There was a time, let's say even 2 decades ago, where we always looked for shields to guard us against any form of opening out and otherwise. The fear of the unknown was very vital for us. I think over the last few years, not necessarily the last 2 years, even before that, as Indian economy is becoming bigger and bigger, I think India has now evolved its own role. And therefore, to be a world player, whether it was the environmental meet in Paris or otherwise, to find solutions to the current to issues of impasse which do come up. There are sensitive sectors like agriculture in India, which will still remain a little sensitive. But I think India is far more open and far more globally integrated. I think
and you see that
what's worrisome, if I may say so, is not economies like India becoming protectionist. It's the world's most powerful economies becoming protectionist.
I think this is where two will tango, right? I'm going to open the floor. Just identify yourself and keep your questions as precise so we give the largest number of opportunities. Sadanand? And just wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome back to Washington, Minister. Thank you for that comprehensive overview. My question is not about the change in India, and it's more about change in the thinking of the BJP. As you're aware, for a long time, the BJP was a party that had some ambivalence about foreign investment. There was a very strong Swadeshi lobby. But we've seen that one of your government's big successes has in fact been attracting a very large amount of FDI. Could you speak a little bit about the changing thought process about FDI within the party that has allowed you to do this?
You see, I think it's not necessarily within the BJP, but across in the political spectrum from right, center, left, you've always had this tendency to initially think that, well, your own economy must do well. And that created all these, what I refer to as the fear of the unknown phenomena. If you read memoirs of different people in relation to what Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and then Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh did, the biggest resistance then came from within the Congress party. In fact, in one of the meetings of the Congress Working Committee, Dr. Singh found himself virtually without any support, and he had to really tell them that I am taking the country to a much better path, and he couldn't convince anyone, to which it's curiously reported that the only person who supported him at that time was Manishankar Iyer. I still don't understand the reason why he did that.
Or if it is true.
Considering his views. Now, having said this, I think there is a big realization as we've evolved, and that's what, when I answered Ashley on the issue of trade, the starting point for any economic activity is investment. And in a developing economy like India, there are inherent limitations as far as availability of that investment is concerned. And therefore, let's look at a sector which has benefited greatly from foreign direct investment, the auto sector in India. Now, we've seen an economy, a closed economy pre-1991, where we had to do away with those 2 or 3 old-fashioned car models in India. And then suddenly when you opened out, you've had India becoming a manufacturing hub, Indian industry itself, at least near Gurgaon, near Pune, near Chennai, now all these auto hubs coming up, hundreds and hundreds of companies making parts coming up, lakhs, millions of jobs being created in the sector. And I think these success stories also, not only have they brought a political, a realization in the political class, but I think they've also helped us in safeguarding against any possible political opposition. And a case in point in recent years is insurance. The sector was investment starved, and therefore you had objections coming from one group or the other, and eventually everybody opened up. I remember when during Mr. Vajpayee's government, some of us suggested opening up the defense sector. It was like opening out a sector which, what are you doing? And then finally we started communicating. This time when I increased the FDI limits in the defense sector, I had to simply communicate in Parliament and say, would you prefer buying 100% of your defense requirements from foreign governments and foreign companies, or you'd rather have a company manufacture it in India with foreign equity participation and foreign technology? And we didn't have any opposition. And I think Indian politics is mature enough to eventually accept some of these arguments. And now the states are saying, please come to my state and set up a defense unit.
Dave. Dave. Yes, David Sutton. Yep. No? Okay. It's okay. It's okay.
Minister Dave Sutton from Lockheed Martin. You mentioned in your comments, in fact, I think it was the ambassador in a small group I was in was discussing, for instance, Australia, population of about 20 million. And India has 20 to 25 million births per year, so that every year India gives birth to an Australia. And so a substantial challenge that still lays ahead, that's always going to be there. And you mentioned, I'm sorry, so my question basically is, you've mentioned 7.5% as a growth rate. Are the low sevens enough? And if that's as much as you can prudently count on, for instance, or assume, are there other areas or efficiencies? You mentioned in your 3 points that processes is certainly something you're focusing on. Are there some of those, or are there particular areas in those that you're focusing on to further this opening up so that these foreign defense manufacturers, for instance, or anyone can come partner and continue to grow so that underprivileged class can participate not just in redistribution, but in actually further growth?
You see, on 7.5%, by world standards or by global standards in the current situation, are we doing well? The answer is yes. But by our own requirement standards, are we doing well enough? I think we can do better. And that's why in an adverse global situation, probably you've settled for that rate. But hopefully, if any of these variable factors, growth returning to the rest of the world at some stage, a better Indian monsoon, continued favorable environment of oil prices. Now, these are variables. And I think the impetus of policy directions in India, if the reforms go on, because the world has also become apprehensive. They keep their fingers crossed, how long will they go on? Or will Indian politics obstruct? And that was actually the very first question. And I think if we are able to cross these hurdles, our ability to do much better would be there. Does 7.5% satisfy either the Indian government or me or the Prime Minister or, let's say, India's political opinion? The clear answer is no. I think by our own yardstick, we realize we have a potential in a helpful environment to do better.
Gentleman whose microphone are usurped.
Sunil Sharma from the IMF. For a leading power, and what I would say an aspiring leading power, India has very few universities in the top 200. If you think about total factor productivity in India, is also among the lowest in Asia. The question I have is that you mentioned very little. I know you were concentrating on talking about macro stabilization issues and the current budget. Could you say something about human capital development? Because this sort of speaks to both in terms of growth possibilities and quality of growth.
A very legitimate question. This is something which is repeatedly mentioned even within India. And though some of our institutions by our own standards are doing well, the IITs, the IIMs, the Institute of Science, the medical institutions, but by global standards, a lot has to be reached. And this year, therefore, in the budget, we've announced an initiative which the concerned departments are going to look at, that 10 government and 10 private sector educational institutions to be selected on merit and then prepared to actually become global institutions in terms of quality. I think a legitimate question and a legitimate concern, an area which was not on the agenda. We were satisfied that the IITs are very good by Indian standards, but are they amongst the world beaters? They produce some of the best students, and therefore for the first time this year, a special provisioning we've made. Let's start with 10 private sector and 10 governmental institutions and take them in that direction.
Fred, I'll give you the last question, absolutely briefly, because I know the minister has to leave.
Mr. Minister, it's a pleasure to see you again. Fred Bergston from the Peterson Institute. I'd like to try to maybe wrap it up by pulling together a couple of things that have been raised. Ashley raised the trade question, and you suggested that attitudes were changing, and positive attitude toward reform, you mentioned at the outset, may apply in that area as well. And you now suggested the need to get the growth rate up even further. The question is whether you have seriously considered trying to get that additional boost to growth from new trade initiatives, because that's been a tried and true strategy elsewhere. China did it, Korea did it, Taiwan did it, Mexico did it. And particularly to get the kind of increase in manufacturing output that you need, almost surely is going to require a sharp increase in exports into a hopefully more hospitable world market. So as you think about rounding out your strategy, getting now those extra dimensions, is that something that commends itself and something you think could be added in the politics of what we know in this country is a contentious area and is always difficult to carry forward?
I think it does. I think it does. And the fact that in this otherwise a globally adverse environment, by putting some domestic policies in place, using our investments and surpluses cleverly, we've managed to sustain some growth. One of the biggest areas of worry has been the declining exports. Both value terms and volume terms. I think the global situation has impacted on that. And therefore, I'm sure to us in the political system and the government, what you've indicated now makes a lot of sense.
On behalf of all of us, the minister has a very hard stop because he has to go to a series of meetings at the Treasury. But on behalf of all of us, Mr. Jately, I really want to thank you for clarity and candor. And you have always been very welcoming of us. We've come to dinner, Carnegie and me personally, and I want to invite you. You have a podium here. Anytime you want to come back, we would be delighted to see you. And I want to wish you and your delegation all the best for the discussions in the next 2 days. Thank you all.